If you've been following this channel, you may have noticed that I tend to cover games that are kind of in that B game realm. Sure, I've covered things with a little bit more pull or higher budgets as well, but for some reason, I'm always drawn to games that serve more as proof of concepts, experimental departures, and cult classics. Both established and titles that I think have the makings of being called such in the future. And this is not a coincidence. Whether I'm at a brick and mortar location or an online storefront, it is always the games that I haven't heard much about that grab my attention. Bold cover art, weird titles, and just games that have a certain amount of mystery to them. For some reason, I more often gravitate to this space in gaming over the latest and greatest. And in today's day and age of nearly constant discounts and sales for pretty much any season and holiday coming out of the online marketplaces, I often find myself browsing games with names I've never heard of at prices that just seem too good to be true. At its best, this approach has led me to titles like Titan Chaser, which I purchased for about the price of a Coke. A title that resonated with me so much that it has since become a favorite of mine. A game that I will always recommend, even if it is a bit on the weird side. But at its worst, this approach has put me in front of some stupid, uninspiring, and at times just flat out broken games. So it's always a bit of a gamble. But this video is on a game that I purchased for about $2 based solely off of a marginally compelling title and some cozy liminal vibes in the screenshots. So the risk of getting something that I wouldn't like is hardly surprising, and in some ways is to just be expected. But this was not a case of glitchy or unfinished design, clipping environments, sound issues, or constant bugs, even though I did have the game crash on me quite a few times. No, instead, more often than not, I found myself surprised by how high quality this game presentation and design were. Instead, this title may have been one of the worst written and morally bankrupt games that I've ever played. A game where its plot was so offensive, poorly researched, and a title that always seemed to make choices so painfully tone-deaf and reprehensible that it may have been one of the most despicable games that I've ever played. And that's including shock games such as the Postal series, Manhunt, and the usury-laden capitalist hellscape that is Animal Crossing. I am of course talking about 101 Games' 2020 release of The Suicide of Rachel Foster. First things first, I'm going to issue a spoiler warning here for The Suicide of Rachel Foster, but also for the Fulbright Company's 2013 classic, Gone Home. As in the writing of this video, I found it important to compare and contrast the two games. Both titles are certainly similar in terms of how they are structured, as they are both games about exploring a space and trying to figure out why it has so suddenly emptied out, and both games tell narratives that share certain themes and sensitive subject matters. And speaking of sensitive subject matter, just in case you missed the disclaimer at the beginning of this video and you couldn't tell by the title of this game, The Suicide of Rachel Foster features, well, suicide. And not of Rachel Foster, oddly enough. She dealt with far worse, it turns out, but more on that later. And I chose the word features because it is not simply sprinkled into the subject matter of the plot, but it is also depicted in a fully playable sequence. But somehow, suicide, even in this poorly depicted state, and I will explain why in a little, is hardly the most controversial of topics, as this game features the grooming of a young girl as a key element of its plot. But even this is elevated when the grooming is happening between a highly educated man and a girl trying to figure out how to overcome dyslexia and communication issues. And in a turn of events, this game also features murder in one of the most repugnant ways I've ever seen. Gone Home also covers issues such as grooming to a much more loose and interpretive state, but also features issues such as depression, coming to grips with one's identity and sexuality, and potential suicidal ideation. But it does all of these things in a completely different way and arguably a more tasteful and respectful manner than The Suicide of Rachel Foster. And then both of these games feature a potential supernatural presence in their respective environments. So, what is The Suicide of Rachel Foster? In short, it is a walking simulator. If you are unfamiliar with that term, it essentially refers to an adventure game with an emphasis on the gradual exploration of an environment, with the story being revealed to the player through discovering key items and observing small details in the game's setting. But one of the key differentiators between a walking simulator and a more immersive sim game like BioShock or Deus Ex is a conspicuous lack of action gameplay. Some notable examples of walking simulators are games like Giant Sparrow's What Remains of Edith Finch, Everybody's Gone to the Rapture out of the Chinese Room, Campo Santo's Firewatch, and then of course Stav Stoshak's Titan Chaser, and obviously the other topic of this video, Gone Home. Rachel Foster takes place in the Timberline Hotel, an environment which couldn't be more blatantly influenced by The Shining's Overlook Hotel, down to a not-so-subtle establishing shot showing a car's ascent to the building, liminal hallways, and even the stark red paint of both of the building's bathrooms. Fuck, I mean, even in choosing the name the Timberline Hotel, this is an obvious shout out to the Kubrick adaptation, with the real-world Timberline Lodge in Mount Hood, Oregon being used for all of the exterior shots of the overlook in that film. But the key factor that these two fictional hotels share is their complete isolation from the outside world and snowy conditions that maroon the casts of both stories in their confines. We play as Nicole Wilson, the daughter of the previous owners of the Timberline, a man named Leonard McGrath, and a woman named Claire Wilson. And through a truly impressive opening that features a awesome establishing shot of the player making their way through a crowd of funeral attendants interspersed with shots of Nicole reading the final letter from her now deceased mother, we are given the setup. Nicole's family is dead, and she has now inherited the Timberline Hotel, with her mother's last wishes for Nicole to sell the building and use the proceeds towards her education while paying off quote-unquote that girl's family. With this letter, we are given the first glimpses of this game's attitude towards its subject matter. First, your mother makes it clear that she was suffering through some sort of condition while writing this letter that would soon render her unable to communicate, with her death also being imminent. And even in this last correspondence, she blames your father for destroying your family. She blames an affair that Nicole's father had with that young woman, and the same young woman's suicide shortly after the affair had been made public, for destroying the family. In reality, that young woman was a young girl named Rachel, who we soon find out was 16 years old, possibly younger at the time that Nicole's father, Leonard, a 49-year-old hotel owner and educated astrophysicist, engaged in a sexual relationship with her. Remember, this is a 16-year-old girl who a married 49-year-old man with a daughter at roughly the same age decided to start having a sexual relationship with, but still Nicole's mother calls this an affair and places the majority of the blame on this girl and sees her suicide as sort of a good riddance. Before carrying on in her final letter about relationship advice for Nicole, talking about being a good Christian, and then selling her family's property. Right away, it is clear that Claire, Nicole's mother, is not concerned with the death of Rachel. She views herself as the true victim in this story, and simultaneously a good Christian, one who loved her daughter more than anything else, and even celebrated Nicole when she decided to march against abortion in her first year of college. And I only bring this up because it's somewhat important later in the story. We are not supposed to like Claire from the jump, and Daniel Azara, the main writer of this story, and the rest of the team at 101 Games go out of their way to take every opportunity to villainize her while making some truly, for lack of a better word at this moment, interesting choices when it comes to Leonard. Upon arriving at the Timberline Hotel, Nicole makes her way through the old building, a long since abandoned business and home, in order to prepare for its audit and sale, and also for the attorney Benjamin Jenkins to arrive to aid in the process. But before I continue, I feel that it is important to establish where the Timberline is located geographically, because 101 Games was very strategic in where they placed it, and in my opinion, it was just as calculated as establishing bias against Claire in these early stages of the story. Before the game begins proper and the player is moved into Nicole's first-person perspective, the suicide of Rachel Foster greets the player with a loading screen that shows a postcard from Montana. And this is notable because as of the time of this writing, well, the age of consent in that state is 16. And the reason that I say that this was strategic will become a little bit more obvious as this video goes on, but even with this setup, things should be a little obvious. A story that features an affair between a 49-year-old man and a 16-year-old girl, this setting only serves to muddy the waters between what is legal and what is moral. 101 Games had plenty of choices where to place this game while conjuring up connections to The Shining. The Shining took place in the Rockies, with the Overlook specifically in Colorado, where the age of consent is 17. In fact, Montana is the only state that the Rockies touch where the unrestricted age is at a current low of 16. The Timberline Lodge, where 101 got this hotel's namesake, is in Oregon, where all parties need to be 18. And I'm just gonna say this, I'm from California, where the age is 18. So I have my opinions. And I fully understand that Danielle Zara is from Rome, where the age is much lower, but fuck man, looking up all these age of consent laws made me feel like Matt Gaetz before scheduling a date.
The New York Times is running a story that I have traveled with a 17-year-old woman.
Allegedly speaking, of course. Sure, we can be charitable to 101 and mention that Kubrick's adaptation was filmed in both Oregon and Montana, which could be one of the reasons they placed it here, but I don't know. That would be doing some heavy lifting considering the fact that this story, in some ways, is centered around a sexual relationship between a 49-year-old man and a 16-year-old. And this obfuscation only becomes more obvious as the story goes on. But if we aren't being charitable, this is just a shit show. Once the game becomes truly playable, and after following instructions that Jenkins left on the Timberline's answering machine, Nicole makes her way to the Master Suite, a room that once served as a home for Nicole, Claire, and Leonard. And it is both in this space and Leonard's office downstairs that we get a feel for who this man was. An academic with multiple degrees in astrophysics, someone who studies spirituality and the cosmos, solves complex math problems over coffee, and someone who is simultaneously obsessing over Rachel even after her death while leaving his own daughter's room unchanged for the decade since she's been gone. But even though this space does try to paint Leonard in a more charitable light, and even if Nicole harbors resentment towards her father and how his actions led to the disintegration of her family, it is usually weighed against the remaining fondness of the man that she remembers, and this only grows as the rest of the game progresses. 101 Games loves Leonard. Everyone in this story has a sort of reverence towards the man outside of Claire, and it only becomes more and more pronounced until it borders on the insane, and he is simultaneously being foiled against Claire throughout the narrative in such a way to show that he was the cool and responsible one, while she was always the cold and brash counterpart in the relationship. Azara is always setting the tone that Leonard, a pedophile, is more likable, more intelligent, and in some ways a more reasonable person than the uptight and overly religious Claire. And yes, I am making a value judgment here. Leonard is a pedophile. Rachel was the same age as his daughter and they were both classmates, and he was 100% grooming her. I don't give a fuck what Montana laws are. I've read online that some people make the distinction that this game centers more around themes of ephebophilia than just straight up pedophilia, but I think comedian Gianmarco Soresi summed up that argument better than pretty much anyone else could.
We don't make those distinctions is because it's very hard to explain the difference without sounding like a pedophile.
As Nicole makes her way through the master suite and into her old bedroom, we learn a little about our character's background. She was a hockey player, into punk-adjacent music, played the bass, had a feminist streak, and had adopted some of her father's interest in astronomy, even though all of that is overshadowed by the most bizarrely rendered lava lamp that I've ever seen in her old room. This little time capsule dedicated to Nicole also serves to ground us in the era that this game takes place, with her room looking like a teenager's room from the 80s, played against the much older hotel, grounding us 10 years later, firmly in 1993. But this quick exploration of her old space is cut short when a conspicuously placed telephone starts to ring.
Hello?
Can you hear me? Is this Miss McGrath?
Wilson. McGrath was my father's.
This is Helena Federal Emergency Management Agency. My name is Irving Crawford.
On the other end is the second principal character in this story, Irving Crawford, a FEMA agent that seems to have been tasked by Nicole's lawyer to assist Nicole during her time at the hotel. Nicole initially rejects this man's help upon hearing from him, but also makes the strange choice of holding on to this early iteration of a cell phone while deciding that it's time to leave the hotel before the storm outside worsens.
I don't know what Jenkins told you, but I have zero intention of staying here longer than, let's say, 20 minutes.
Oh. But the storm.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. I'm leaving straight away.
Maybe you're not aware.
Thanks for everything. Irving, right?
Irving. Yeah.
Bye.
Irving warns against this, saying that the conditions are only going to put her in danger, but Nicole decides to take the risk and returns to her car, only to find that its keys are missing from where she left them.
Tell me you changed your mind.
You there?
Uh-huh. Oh, yeah, right. It's a direct line.
I can't find my car keys. My fucking car keys. I left them on the seat.
You sure?
Think so. Maybe someone...
No.
Between the conveniently placed phone, the missing car keys, and the crystal clear cellular reception during a blizzard in 1993, it should be pretty obvious where this game is going. But this setup establishes what the rest of the game is going to be like. Nicole is stranded up at the Timberline for the entirety of this story, a story that takes place over 9 days. An early expositional voicemail establishes that phone service has been disconnected at the Timberline, even though the gas and power are still available for some reason. Nicole's only contact to the outside world is this Irving character, and the main conceit of this title is to explore the space, making sure that Nicole has food, power, and hot water, all while peeling away at the mystery surrounding the events that led to Rachel's suicide, and the ensuing collapse of her family, all while developing the relationship between Nicole and this Irving. So at the risk of sounding reductive, this game is incredibly similar in structure to Campo Santo's Firewatch, with that game's narrative being focused around 2 park rangers that communicate over radio, and Gone Home in the sense that we have this large space set in the 90s with uncovering the mystery surrounding our family as the main focus. And similarly to Gone Home, and more deliberately The Shining, it doesn't take long for Rachel Foster to start flirting with evidence of the supernatural. Between the circumstances that brought you to this place, the paranoia that gets baked in with Nicole being stranded here, secret hallways and crawl spaces, and the overall ambient noise that just permeates this setting as the storm wages outside, this is an incredibly atmospheric setting. And while the narrative does develop into something that I can't speak too highly of, the visuals, sound mixing, sense of space in some key moments, and even voice acting go a long way to lure the player into the experience. Wind coming through the cracks in the walls, floors reacting to Nicole's weight, and small noises mixed into the ambient tracks that include samples that sound eerily like children laughing at times make it so that you always feel uneasy while exploring the space. In a lot of ways, the Timberline is the real star of this show, and if I'm going to criticize the narrative, the writing, and scenario design of this game so thoroughly, I think that it's only fair that I give credit where it is due, and that is to this environment. The Timberline is a very creepy and convincing space, and it lends itself to the paranoia and dread of being isolated in a space where you never wanted to be in the first place. The actual gameplay in this experience is pretty standard stuff for the type of game that this is, with each of the 9 days bookending this experience into chapters of sorts, and your given goal changing with each passing day. I've only outlined day 0 so far, and upon finding out that you're stranded in the hotel, the game cuts to black and lets you know that you are now in the next chapter. In this case, day 1, which is in reality a continuation of day 0, with this chapter's goal of descending down to the boiler room in order to restore hot water to the hotel. This chapter basically serves as an excuse to keep the player uncomfortable while making Irving and Nicole more comfortable with one another. There are some attempts at humor, with Nicole recalling how she would refer to the boiler as the old farting ghost when she was a kid, but that kind of thing goes mostly nowhere. And at its worst, it just kind of comes across as kind of cheesy.
Old farting ghost, you rank spirit, wake up!
Huh?
Nothing, just talking to an old friend.
But this day is somewhat uneventful. The day does end with Nicole going back up to the master suite, presumably to take a shower, but first she decides to pick up her old childhood bass guitar after telling Irving that she is going to do a little unplugged session.
Now I'm just gonna chill in my room with the posters of my favorite bands, playing my old bass, totally unplugged.
But even in this little throwaway sequence, you can hear that the slide of her fingers on the strings are clearly amplified. This may be a silly thing to point out, but even this is a tiny example of the game telling you that one thing is happening and then immediately contradicting itself, or taking big leaps in logic without taking the player through the steps to get there, and this is something that persists up until the finale. Day 2 begins with Nicole standing in the overlook of the hotel. Where the last chapter ended in her bedroom, we find that Nicole has moved without our agency. This is a device in this storytelling that I'm of 2 minds of. It shows that we are not always present for Nicole's movements, and when we are not actively playing as her, she wanders off and carries on with her day until we are returned back to her perspective. On one hand, I found it effective for showing that time had passed, but there are certain uses of this device as the game goes on that I believe are used to hand wave away certain plot holes and simply have us join Nicole after certain discoveries have already been made. And at its worst, which I will cover shortly, it is just used to kind of cheaply ratchet the dread. But here, watching the sunlight come through the overlook, it is a neat little way of getting us back into the action, enjoying the morning before learning that Irving had stayed up all night in his office in case Nicole needed any help. With the early communications between these characters being established in a mostly stressful situation, Nicole was fairly rude to Irving in the beginning, but hearing that he has been looking out for her in such a way, it seems to soften her resolve against the man.
You didn't sleep? Like, at all?
I thought you might need something, and
But you didn't go home? Because of me?
Whenever you are talking to Irving, 101 tried to make these conversations slightly interactive, similarly to how Campo Santo did in Firewatch, but your choices are pretty much always inconsequential. Little quips that only serve to interject an illusion of choice before returning the dialogue firmly back onto its rails. Sometimes it works flawlessly, but other times it can come across as really unnatural.
Oh, Irving?
yeah?
I like that you call me Nikki. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas, Nikki.
Oh, Irving?
Yeah?
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas, Nikki.
But after this brief conversation, we learn that the mission of the day is to explore the kitchen and find some food for Nicole. This is fairly straightforward until it is discovered that the food in the pantry has turned before Irving tells Nicole to check the walk-in freezer. Again, this is just another straightforward objective, but upon finding the food, the door to the freezer locks behind Nicole. After a moment of panic and trying to get a hold of Irving, the door gently opens on its own. But as far as how it landed for me, I just figured it was Irving fucking with Nicole. Sure, Irving said that he was in his office somewhere on the mountain, but between some not so convincing performances...
Hello?
Hey, you still there, Irving?
Huh? Oh, yeah. I'm still here, Miss McGrath. I mean, Miss Wilson.
Nicole's keys being taken, the cell phone, and now this. I had a pretty fucking good suspicion that this dude was here with me and now is just fucking with Nicole. After getting some food and shaking off the fact that she almost froze to death, Irving calls again to let us know that our lawyer friend had to turn back after almost getting stuck in the snow, and that we are now here on our own until the storm passes, which now leaves Nicole fully in charge of inspecting and auditing the hotel. This whole sequence mostly serves as an excuse to take Nicole up to the second floor of the hotel for the first time, a section of the hotel that has fallen into extreme disrepair, and to introduce us to the sealed off west wing of the hotel. Nicole tells Irving that behind these doors was the way to Leonard's old man cave. We are unable to explore this area for the time being, and Nicole shows no real interest in what is behind this door during this chapter. Instead, she is more interested in Irving's knowledge of the building, and more or less lets him know that she finds him suspicious.
Hello? You there?
You always have an answer to everything.
What do you mean?
I've joked about it, but it's not funny anymore.
I don't understand, Nicole.
You know how to turn on the furnace. You know where to find food, and that the fridge door is busted. You know my family's story and the hotel's.
It's up to FEMA to deliver the supplies to isolated places like the Timberline. I've been up there with the truck every month since I've been on duty. Is something wrong?
After a little back and forth, and after Irving is able to explain away his familiarity with the place, Nicole makes her way back towards her room. But on the way, a random phone in the hallway starts to ring.
Yeah. Hello? Who is this? Who the hell are you?
Rachel is still there. Don't sell the hotel.
Is this a joke? Who is this?
Don't do anything stupid.
You're gonna pay for this lame-ass joke. I have a phone, a cell phone. I'm talking with FEMA, and I'm gonna get them to call the sheriff.
Again, Irving and Nicole talk about the strangeness surrounding the hotel, but Irving is able to once again explain away any strangeness and chalk this event up to a bitter local more or less playing a prank on her. But again, we are treated to 101's bolstering of Leonard and skirting around any wrongdoing that he may have done in the past.
You talking about anyone in particular?
Well, her death ruined two families that everyone looked up to. Yours and Rachel's. Your father, McGrath, the genius astrophysicist, and Rachel's father, the upstanding Reverend Foster, known all over the county. Not something easy to forget around here.
Day 2 ends with this phone call, and as it goes on and Nicole gets heated, the conversation basically ends with her saying, "Yeah, fuck the world." The next time that we take control of Nicole, she is awakened by Irving in the middle of the night, and temporarily mistakes his voice for Leonard's.
Hey, cutie pie.
Daddy?
Nicole, it's Irving.
But this call exists to propel us into our next objective. There is a partial power outage due to the weather, and Irving wants Nicole to go to the breaker. This goal is yet another attempt to unsettle the player, as it requires navigating through the darkened hotel with nothing more than a found Polaroid camera, using its momentary flash to illuminate the way before it goes dark on your way to a crawl space to get down to the power room, which currently has its front door conveniently locked. And I'd be lying if I didn't mention that during this sequence, I got flashbacks to a much better game called Visage, which I've also covered on this channel. This path is claustrophobic and creepy, and although we do find a flashlight on the way to the power room, it is used just to show how fucked up this space is, with a single mannequin limb just laid out in the space, for reasons. Okay, there are reasons, but they are not made apparent until the last day, so for now, this is just to be spooky scary. In the breaker room, we return power to the hotel, but we also find a lipstick case, which Nicole finds very suspicious. But again, Irving waves this off, stating that lost items in a hotel are a very common occurrence. As soon as we leave this power room, the day ends. Day 4 is the first real day of consequence to this narrative outside of establishing the setting and atmosphere. We return to Nicole's perspective and find that she has ransacked Leonard's room in order to find clues about what happened with Rachel, and that Nicole has taken the extra step and done her best Charlie from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia impression and built something of an evidence board. This chapter takes place solely in this room, with Nicole and Irving going back and forth over newspaper clippings and other evidence that points to some of the strange goings-on around Rachel's death. First, we find that her body was found at the base of a cliff, and that the 16-year-old was 9 weeks pregnant at the time of her death. Officials were aware that Leonard and Rachel had been spending hours alone at a time before her death, and that the two had become physical at some point. Claire was the whistleblower on their romantic involvement, and she fled the timberline with Nicole after she had confronted Leonard. We learn that there was a suicide note left behind, and it is truly repugnant, as not only are the words hard to imagine from someone on the edge of taking their own life, but even handwriting experts doubted the note's authenticity. I don't even feel like reading this thing aloud, especially as what really happened to Rachel comes into plain view, but I will put the text up on screen now. Along the newspaper articles and maps, there are also a few tabloid entries here as well that mention that a classmate of Rachel's had seen the girl at the Timberline Hotel after her reported death, and then there is also evidence on the desk in front of Nicole. A picture of Reverend Foster, Rachel's father, and examining this photo really just gives us a line of dialogue about how Leonard and the Reverend would play chess for hours and debate the great mysteries of the universe, before Nicole turns cold on the Reverend.
Back in the day, I thought he was a kind of reptilian with a human skin suit.
His daughter's death destroyed his ego. His faith made him even more cynical and lonely than he already was.
I can remember him demanding total perfection from Rachel. That was insane.
And then after a back and forth with Irving, Nicole mentions that it was unlikely that the Reverend was involved with Rachel's untimely death, but also that he shouldn't be taken at face value in this case. The lipstick has also been placed here, and me personally, I received a little lesson in cosmetics as Nicole explains that lipstick starts to smell really bad after a certain amount of time, which is just something that I didn't know, and that the particular brand on the casing had been discontinued shortly after the time that she was living in the Timberline, with the importance of these quips pointing to the idea that this stick had belonged to Rachel and that it had been preserved and only recently opened. And then finally there is a poetry book on the cosmos that Leonard had scrawled notes about Rachel in. But the book had been published years after her death, pointing to both Leonard's continued obsession with the girl that he had groomed and the idea that the man still believed that some form of the girl had tethers to the Timberline. The fifth day is essentially just a short dream sequence where a younger Nicole makes her way towards something that is lightly burning like a flare in the middle of a snow-covered forest clearing. All the while, Leonard's disembodied voice beckons Nicole forward while waxing poetic about how the light we see from stars can often come from bodies that are long since dead. All the while, Nicole is being led to the flare, which takes the shape of Rachel's retainer in the snow as she gets closer. Nicole cries out that she loves her father one last time as he seems to be disappearing before he replies,
I know, Daddy. I've always known it. I love you too. Say it again, please.
I love you. I love you. I love you. I love you. Rachel, 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 Rachel.
Day 6 is a fun one, even if it doesn't have much to do with the rest of the plot in a lot of ways. Irving lets us know that there was a TV crew of ghost hunters that had previously rented a room at the Timberline, and he plays an audio clip that makes it sound like the crew had come into contact with something spooky. After identifying the room that the crew had stayed in and then finding that it had since been padlocked, Nicole takes a quick little detour down to the power room to grab a screwdriver in order to pop the latch. And once inside, we find evidence that the crew had left in a hurry, leaving behind most of their equipment. But the two most important bits of tech here are a parabolic microphone that we soon claim as our own, and a VCR with a tape in it that details the events that scared the producers off. A clip that is mostly obscured, but it does show one key detail. This is either our first real encounter with the paranormal, or further evidence that someone is fucking with Nicole.
Hey!
For fuck's sake, Irving!
Oh, what did I do?
He gave me a heart attack.
The 7th day is another strange one, but there are a few noteworthy developments. First, it's Christmas, so that's kind of cute or whatever, with Irving remaining in his office that is totally nowhere near the Timberline.
Oh, hold on a sec. Don't go anywhere, okay?
Huh? Oh, okay.
You have a good night too, Miss Flattery. Merry Christmas.
Good night, hon!
Nicole and Irving do some light flirting, and then there is a strange chiming sound that can be heard throughout the hotel. This is our objective for the day. Use our newly acquired directional mic in order to find where that strange noise is coming from. And for whatever reason, it was in this mission that I had my game crash 3 times during this sequence. I don't know what flag I was throwing up, but it crashed in almost an identical manner each time while progressing through the same particular hallway, and the only fix that I could find was by taking an alternative path, one that went nowhere near where the mic was leading me. And this almost made me quit the experience altogether. I was already more than put off by this point, but there was a sort of train wreck quality that kept me engaged, despite my better judgment. The crashing was one thing, but the game only checkpointing at the beginning of each day, it meant listening to the intro conversations repeatedly until I had managed to step over the invisible tripwires that were blowing up my progression. But let me get back to the plot. Eventually, the chiming leads Nicole to a broom closet with a crack in the wall, suggesting that the wind was responsible for the sound. But inside the closet is a photo of a crowded Christmas party in the hotel's ballroom. Another not-so-subtle nod to The Shining's July 4th ball. And seeing this image makes Nicole reminisce on the event, where she has this to say about Rachel.
I saw he wouldn't stop staring at that girl.
Rachel.
She talked and moved with the grace and confidence of an adult. She wore a dress with a bow on her back. She was so beautiful. Perfect. Fuck. It was the beginning of the end, and we were breaking out the champagne.
This line truly frustrated me. Between bolstering Leonard as nothing more than an academic at this point, using terms like relationship and affair instead of grooming or molesting, or anything that points to the power imbalance that is inherent to a 49-year-old initiating a sexual relationship with a 16-year-old. And quick aside, it is stated that the relationship went on for about 9 months before her life ended, effectively giving Rachel a 3 out of 4 chance of being 15 when this relationship started. And by having her only signifiers being tied to either her learning disorder, looks, or sexuality, this line of dialogue lands firmly in the realm of victim blaming. Shit like, did you see how she was dressed? Did you see how she carried herself? She was totally asking for it. Fuck that. Hell, as far as I can tell, there was only one environmental clue in this game that suggested that Leonard was a pedophile. And this letter was clearly delivered as a threat by someone in the area. But 101 Games makes sure that even this clear indictment of Leonard's character cannot exist without them editorializing it, as this item's description reads as just slander. It is not slander, it is the correct word for the type of man that Leonard was. I get that this description is Nicole's interpretation of the writing, and she clearly has some bias towards her father, but the facts are pretty bare, and 101 seems very interested in obscuring that this was an abusive situation. But I'm afraid that this frustration that I'm showing right now is linked directly to what happens in the last 2 chapters of the game. Day 8 is, in my opinion, the low point of Daniel Azzara's writing. It starts in an especially jarring way, where Nicole wakes up in a dilapidated chapel that is connected to the hotel via creepy as fuck underground tunnel. You can tell that the developers thought this would be a great shock and awe moment after they had laid out so much evidence to point to the direction of ghosts and specters, and while I did think it was a clever way to return to our character's perspective, I thought we were a bit late in the game for it to start doling out jump scares. So instead, it just kind of made me question what the subtext was here. Eventually, you make your way back up to your bedroom and reclaim your equipment, and let Irving know what just happened. Nicole admits to having sleepwalking episodes in the past, but given the potential intruder in the building and the paranormal element, I don't know what the writers were inferring. Are we supposed to believe that she had just sleptwalked over there? Are we supposed to believe that a ghost had possessed her body? Or are we supposed to believe that an intruder had picked her up, possibly drugged her, and left her in that space? And with that being a likely answer, what does that even say about her previous sleepwalking episodes? Are we being made to believe that she was being moved around when she was a child, when she was living here? I mean, what the fuck is this? But after some dialogue about creepy stuff, Irving and Nicole have yet another flirty moment out of nowhere.
Irving?
Yeah?
I like that you call me Nikki.
With your equipment returned, you make your way back down past the basement towards the church. Another transmission between Irving and Nicole takes place during this walk, and Nicole discusses the roles that her parents had, not only at the hotel, but also the roles that they had in raising her. And again, we are met with 101's invisible hand pushing our perception towards the intellectual and resourceful Leonard, while making sure to present Claire as colder and more manipulative in nature.
I gather you didn't exactly have a high opinion of your mother when you were a kid.
Well, she was really busy with the hotel. I was always running after Leonard. He was much more fun than she was, no doubt about it. He was a philosopher capable of calculating the motion of celestial bodies while taking apart and refitting a motorcycle in less than half an hour.
What about her?
In the same half hour, she could have audited a business balance sheet. There you go.
Ah, a businesswoman.
No. What I understood later, living in such proximity to her, is that Mom loved feeling needed.
But given what happens next, this is just insane to me. Back in the church while talking to Irving about how Claire would often run back and forth from the church to the hotel with supplies, Nicole recalls a secret storage room that she was never able to find in the time that she had lived in the Timberline. Leonard had taught her a riddle in order to find it, but she had never been able to locate the room. Lucky for us, we don't have to solve the puzzle, and that is because while we are on our way back towards the hotel proper, a bright red butterfly comes out of nowhere and gently glides towards the hidden compartment. After moving the sliding clapboard, Nicole finds her way in another crawlspace of sorts, and this is a much more foreboding section than the crawlspaces we had seen before, with snow intrusion from the outside, and at its end we can make out rays of light that were emanating from the opposite side of an iron door through what I can only guess were vents that doubled as peepholes. And once you open this gate, well, I'm just gonna let my footage roll for a second. You could probably tell by my gameplay footage that I was dumbfounded in this section, with the chalkboard being the most striking thing I've probably ever seen in terms of environmental design. Giant letters that communicate what Linus Tech Tips understands to be the hard R.
Like, I'm not gonna deny that I dropped my fair share of hard R's back then because we didn't even, the term.
But as fucked and edgy as all this is, the subtext of this room, that is the scary part. A room that Nicole and Irving understand to be a replica of Rachel's own room back at her house, a room with no windows, walls marked with chalk in a desperate attempt to have it look less like a cell in a rudimentary art style, a room meant for Rachel. A room where there is a speak and spell toy and a chalkboard meant to be learning aids for someone struggling with dyslexia, and the lesson for the day is retard, a slur that Rachel had been bullied with since childhood. Like, what the fuck is this? A pedophile fuck dungeon where the victim is subjected to who knows what horrors while simultaneously being berated for a disorder? Irving is completely freaked out after this room is explained to him, suggesting that authorities be called in immediately and that Nicole find her way out of the hotel altogether. But Nicole also finds a key that fits her childhood music box that is back in the master suite, and decides that she needs to get to the bottom of this mystery. Irving even suggests that the key may be evidence that someone may have been in her room at some point, but that doesn't deter her either. But when he infers what this room may have said about Leonard's state of mind, especially after prolonged isolation in the hotel, Nicole once again defends the reverence that 101 Games seems to have for her father.
If it's true, you realize what that means?
What? What are you trying to tell me?
Your father, he spent years in there, in total solitude. With the weight of his family and Rachel on his conscience, he wasn't the kind of guy to just let the past slide with a shrug. You know that too.
You're joking, right? You think he did this?
Think about it. That room could be an act of love. Distorted, even morbid, but in his eyes...
How dare you? My father might have had a lot of weaknesses. But surely, what you're saying... Leave out that he cheated on my mom. Leave out that he fell in love with a 16-year-old. But fucking hell, don't you dare even think that. He would never have built a fucking underground shrine for a dead person.
And I can't follow this writing. We have Irving minimizing the existence of this room by calling it a potential act of love, Nicole immediately defending her father and using language like fell in love with a 16-year-old, and then having her breaking point being the idea that Leonard had built a shrine to a dead person. I'm just going to throw out that before we get to the end, that in the last chapter, there is some further information that makes this situation even more murky. But the point remains. Nicole, Claire, Irving, really everyone including the media coverage simply looks at Rachel's suicide as an isolated incident. And they treat it like she did a bad thing by getting involved with a married man and then killed herself, and case closed. The only dissenting opinion present in this game comes in the form of a few pieces of paper that are immediately labeled as slander. At no point does anyone, and seemingly the developers, find it necessary to point out that Leonard was the only adult in this situation. And that is why this Montana thing is so fucked up. We can say that this 16-year-old was effectively an adult when it came to this sexual situation, but that same 16-year-old wouldn't have been able to buy liquor, smoke cigarettes, or even join the fucking military. But being groomed, influenced, and later impregnated by a man of nearly 50 years, that's all well and good. At no point does anyone look at this man as if he was in the wrong. It is seldom brought up that he had a daughter that was effectively the same age, and what is all the worse is that we are never given any true insight into who Rachel was as a person, with no further characterization other than being a victim. By this point in the story, all we know about her, and I'm going to use this game's problematic language, we know that she was viewed as attractive, talked and moved with the grace of an adult, according to Nicole, who clearly harbors some sort of bizarre jealousy towards her, which, who the fuck even knows what that means? Grace of an adult? Fuck all that. We know that she was bullied. We know that her father had expectations for her that were beyond realistic. We know that she needed help for her disorder. And we know that this old dude was obsessed with her. But even this obsession, it was never explained. We were never given any reasons for it outside of looking good and having some sort of nebulous poise. We are never given any real clue into who she was, how she felt, what her motivations were, and all of Leonard's communications regarding her are all nebulous and obsessive. The chapter ends with Nicole hanging up on Irving, recounting the events since she had entered the Timberline to herself, and more or less looking for any alternative viewpoint, including Rachel having faked her own death in order to cope with what she has seen while protecting Leonard's precious image. After these ramblings, she returns to her room and uses the key she found in the dungeon to open her music box. And on the inside, she finds the hockey medal that she won in what happened to be her final game. A game that coincidentally took place on the same night that Rachel had reportedly died, and also the same night that Claire fled the Timberline with Nicole after some sort of altercation occurred between the two parents. The final day is the big one. It begins with Nicole standing in front of the closed-off West Wing, the one place in the hotel that we have not been to yet. Standing here, Nicole explains the events of the game so far to Irving.
There are too many things that I took for granted. It's as if someone was putting pieces of my past in front of me, to show them to me under another light.
A one-off comment during this conversation causes Nicole to retrace the events of the night that Rachel died. And the first thing Nicole remembers is her mother ordering her to close up the storeroom by the mezzanine. So that becomes our first objective. We trek our way through the hotel to a corner that has not been explored up until now, but while making this video, it became apparent why. This corner, this secret little storage room, was completely blocked off up until now by some large boxes. Inside the room is an elaborate diorama. Dozens of crowded together mannequins with their backs turned to one laying on the ground with a baby doll clutched to its stomach, while another stands over the downed figure brandishing a hockey stick. This scene also marks the end of Nicole's current relationship with Irving, with his tone being completely different the next time we hear from him.
Where are you, Nicole?
It's about time. Did you hear my messages?
How many doors have you opened, Nicole? How many are still missing?
What doors are you talking about?
Keep going.
And if it wasn't clear through his not-so-coded message, it reveals to us that the West Wing has now been open for exploration. Before we make it to Leonard's man cave, seemingly the final goal of this game, we pass through what is obviously a base of operations. Engine diagrams for your Dodge, weather maps, radio equipment, data on Nicole. If it isn't obvious before the madman's monologue kicks in, this is where Irving has been hiding for the majority of this narrative, with him obviously moving around at key moments to keep you on the design path. And yeah, the plot really starts to fall apart here as far as motives and particulars go. How Irving was able to time everything so perfectly and ensure that Nicole was alone in the timberline, Irving requiring that Nicole be here in order to piece everything together, even though he clearly understood the chain of events that led to Rachel's death, and even the last minute reveal that Irving was in reality Rachel's brother, a brother that pretty much nobody remembers. It only gets more convoluted from this point on as we blast towards the game's conclusion. We find out that Irving and Leonard had been trying to piece together the events surrounding Rachel's death for years, and that all of this work has been leading up to this exact moment. And real quick, there is another choice in Irving's monologue that I'm afraid may have gone largely unnoticed by a lot of people. And it's a dumb, subtle thing, but it furthers just how mean-spirited this game is with its subject matter.
Rachel?
She was like that. Free and strong. At the time, I didn't understand her dyslexia. Or what retard meant.
Yeah, that's certainly a fucking choice. But nothing in this game really compares to what might be the most disgusting lines of dialogue that I've ever heard in all of media.
One day, that beautiful, luminous creature met someone. A human being that saw her. For real.
My dad.
Yes. And I was the invisible witness of what happened. A love. Simply a love. Nothing more, nothing less.
I just can't with this fucking game. The brother of a murder victim whose only friend was his sister, somehow able to jump through all these hoops and logic and ignore everything that Leonard had done, and being able to dismiss it all as nothing but the beginning of what was supposed to be a match made in heaven. I can't take that ride with you, little bro. But Nicole seems to accept Irving's claims, and instead she goes into a self-pitying state where she says this.
For the first time in years, I depended on someone. And this is the result.
From here, we make our way deeper into the West Wing, but by this point, enough has fallen into place to really know where this story is going. The man cave really doesn't offer anything too important. The keys to your mom's car down in the garage where this game started, some charcoal drawings of Rachel's naked form, further cementing the idea that Leonard's infatuation with Rachel was purely sexual, and then a projector. This device displays a final message from Leonard. The first time that we're really able to get a sense of who this man was. But it's all just cryptic bullshit for the most part.
We studied, we listened. We listened to her. But all the love in the world wasn't enough to decipher those muted vowels, those wide open eyes, those tears of light.
He vomits word salad that talks about love, the stars, hate, death, and Rachel still being in the hotel. This whole final transmission acts as something of a suicide note for Leonard, but there is never any real sense of self-awareness or owning up to his involvement in the events that consumed his life. He is a tired victim. And this is all just self-important drivel. Right after the reel ends, we hear the scratching of chalk on a blackboard, and in turning around, we see it. We catch the board turning itself over to reveal the word murderer. Suggesting what? That Rachel's in the room? Or that Nicole's the murderer? No, it's not Nicole. Don't worry, this game doesn't go completely insane on top of morally bankrupt. And we are left with our final real objective. Get down to Claire's car in the garage and find the final pieces of the puzzle. And it should be stated that on the way back down to the garage, we see further evidence of the paranormal with doors slamming shut. So it might be the writer's intent to suggest that Leonard was right about everything and that he had somehow pierced the veil between the realm of the living and the dead, and that he was guided by some sort of cosmic force in bringing all of this together with Irving. And now everything that we've seen up into this sequence was just an elaborate stage show to get Nicole to understand the truth behind everything, including the fucked up dungeon room below. But Irving's communication upon finding that dungeon makes things even more confusing, as he seemed genuinely as shocked as Nicole upon hearing about it. And since there is no concrete way of knowing when Irving was being truthful with us or just stringing Nicole along, at its best, this means this whole thing was just a shitty escape room with some really bad writers, but at its worst interpretation, some of the horrors in this hotel were simply forgiven by Irving because he had witnessed real love. Whatever. By this point, I was so alienated that I just wanted to get this thing over with. The final sequence of events takes place upon getting to Claire's car, finding a bloody blanket or shirt wrapped around something in the trunk, and then taking it to the laundry room and cleaning it off for reasons to reveal Rachel's retainer. At this point, Nicole just has a breakdown as she spells out the narrative of what happened that night. Claire had discovered that Leonard was sleeping with Rachel, and seemingly in a fit of rage, Claire killed the 16-year-old with Nicole's hockey stick, presumably in the storage room on the mezzanine. And then she dragged her body into her car, cleaned off the stick, and still managed to get Nicole to her big game with the murder weapon as her piece of equipment. At some point, Nicole realized that she couldn't see her mom in the stands, and that is because Claire was busy driving her car over to a cliff in order to dispose of Rachel's body in an attempt to make it look like she had taken her own life. She then picked up Nicole from the game, then went home, confronted Leonard, and then packed her shit with Nicole and drove off in the middle of the night with an uncle. All of this was known by Irving. It had to have been for the puzzle box he created to work. But after Nicole recounts all this, he thanks her for piecing everything together, with the only potential unique information that Nicole had in all of this being that she kinda stumbled upon her mom looking a little crazy in the garage before they took off to the game. That little tiny, easily misunderstood moment in the mind of a teenager was what made Nicole the missing piece in all this. It's bullshit. And then, finally, Irving's final transmission kinda just speaks for itself.
What? Irving, where are you?
It's white as far as the eye can see, beyond the mountains.
You left the hotel? But it's too cold. You'll die out there. Irving, please.
I've lived in the dark for years. You freed me. And now I can finally rest in the light. I can go back to her.
With it being presumed that Irving, now having completed his mission, ran off into the cold to go kill himself, presumably at the same cliff that Rachel had been thrown off. And it's a pretty unsatisfying moment. This big reveal. Mom did it because she was jealous. And these two creepy, obsessive people that have been just kind of fucking with you for no real reason. But because one of them had an astrophysics degree, we are supposed to think that these random scribbles everywhere were him figuring out that Nicole had to be here in this space 10 years later after everything went down. I mean, what the hell? But the actual ending of this game takes things to a completely insane level. Granted, Nicole now knows the truth of everything, and she's definitely had a fairly rough go of it lately. But the final scene of this game features Nicole deciding to take her own life. After Irving's final transmission, the screen cuts to black and we find Nicole transported into the driver's seat of her car. In the gap between the two scenes, she somehow located and manufactured the means to have the carbon monoxide from the car's tailpipe funneled into the car, and then made sure that it held enough of a seal to hold in the toxic fumes. Jenkins calls as Nicole sits there in a catatonic state. Somehow Jenkins had access to the phone that Irving had supplied her with, which makes no fucking sense. It kind of seemed like it operated more like a walkie-talkie, or that they were the only two lines of communication. But she just explains that she won't be selling the hotel anymore, and then she just turns on the engine. with the game ending as the interior of the car begins to fill with deadly poison. Like, how is this a real game? It should be stated that as this entire sequence requires that you be the one that turns over the engine and effectively kills Nicole yourself, there is an alternative ending where you can turn the engine off before it kills her. But this is hardly even a different ending. Either she dies with her last thoughts being the ramblings of an insane person, or she rambles to herself about how she's going to continue living at the timberline with her entire family now. None of this makes sense. None of it's well researched. It's all insanely mean-spirited, and it betrays some not-so-flattering decision-making by Daniel Azzara and the rest of the staff. I'm not going to go too far into this, but there was a point in my life where death seemed to be a more welcome fate than continuing to struggle, and I took direct actions to leave this world. Luckily, it didn't stick, and I've since gotten to a place where I'm doing infinitely better. And if you're somebody that is completely struggling with something like this, just know that things do get better and that there are plenty of people out there that are willing to help. In fact, if you ever need any help, feel free to reach out to me through DM, and I'll make sure to get you in contact with some resources. And for reasons that I'm not going to state here, I have been exposed to sexual abuse when I was far too young to fully comprehend what was happening. And it took years of therapy and learning to get to the point where I understand the effects that it has had on me. And truthfully, 101 Games takes subject matter that is incredibly sensitive and just all around life-altering shit and uses it to tell a story that not only makes no real sense, but shows a certain degree of hatred for its characters. First, throughout the narrative, we never got the sense that Nicole was mentally unwell. There was clearly some trauma and abandonment issues, but lifelong depression or something more volatile, nothing in this game points to that. And yes, large portions of suicides are impulsive, largely in men, but yeah, suicides can be the result of sudden traumas or severe mind-breaking stress. But again, there is usually some sort of underlying trauma or condition that multiplies that impulsivity. Nicole tracking down the hoses and duct tape and preparing the car in such a manner where she's going to get it right on her first attempt, this is not impulsivity. Not in a hotel where there is a literal side mission to find a damn screwdriver, seemingly the only screwdriver in the entire hotel. And yet, she can find all of this stuff. This is hardly a quick and impulsive way of going. This isn't something like pills or firearms where very little time needs to pass in order for someone to make that choice. And I'd even go as far as to say this is a fairly obscure way of going about it. And even a 1996 study from the National Institutes of Health suggests that nearly 88% of people who do this are men, with most of them middle-aged, with more than 61% of them experiencing severe illness, psychiatric or otherwise. Half of the people who attempted this way were drunk before they attempted, and nearly 40% of the people who used this method had documented previous attempts. I'm not trying to ruin a good story with the facts here, even though it's hardly a good story to begin with, but my point is that this last-minute revelation blindsides the player. There is no foreshadowing, and it all comes across as forced edginess. And while no, a story doesn't need to follow scientific data in order to come across as plausible, there should at least be a thread that leads us here. And there just isn't one that makes sense. And now onto the grooming. Let's just somehow put that on the back burner for a second and analyze the actual beats of this story. Dude meets a girl, in this case as barely legal as it gets. Dude seduces or otherwise initiates a sexual relationship with said girl. Dude is married. Wife finds out. Wife goes crazy and kills girl with a hockey stick and fakes a suicide. Let's forget that medical examiners are a thing and everybody buys it. At what point does this plot call for there to be a fucked up age gap between the characters? How would this story be any different if the girl was 18? What is being done with this setup? What is the author even trying to say? The wife would be just as angry that her husband was cheating on her with a younger woman. This was a choice. It was a choice to set it in Montana. It was a choice to make her the youngest possible age without stepping over some arbitrary age of consent law. I mean, why not make her 15? Oh yeah, then it would be clear that Leonard was a pedophile. So, the writers lived in this nebulous space without having the stones to commit either way. And what do they do with it? They basically tell a story where this creep is the one guiding light in this girl's life without ever giving her a voice for even a second, so we are left operating solely off of what two severely mentally unwell individuals attribute to her understanding of the situation. But the problem here especially is an authorial intent, because every single character in this game of consequence constantly builds up this piece of shit every opportunity they get, and instead of having any of this experience make sense, whenever we hear from Leonard, He just talks about the stars and whatever other nonsense, while the writers set out from the beginning to completely make Claire the only villain of this story. And she is a villain. In some ways, somehow, she is the main villain. She is an absolute monster. She is also a hypocrite, being super religious and pro-life, but having no real problems killing Rachel and her unborn child, which kind of tracks, at least anecdotally for me, as most of the hardcore pro-life people I've ever met, the type of people who protest outside of Planned Parenthoods and stuff, they usually have very little concern for the welfare of people once they are actually born, and they just seem to want to weaponize attacks on women's bodily autonomy as a method of control. And even when Claire wrote what would end up being her last communication with her daughter, who again was the same age as the girl she had killed, she stated that that girl did the right thing by ending her life. Jesus, but at no point does anyone outside of her truly point to what this man did as wrong. And the writers want to hide behind as many technicalities as possible. Yes, Claire was a monster, but she did what she did because Leonard was also a monster and his actions made her insane. This story did not need to include this element of such a gross age gap, and although it wouldn't have been anything revolutionary if they had changed it, it would have avoided being gross, alienating, and even going as far as to trivialize traumas that have the capacity to completely destroy or otherwise reshape the victims' lives. Considering the plot and the players, it almost seems that every character in this story is just a vehicle for the writer to inflict pain onto in an almost sadistic manner, with a particular prejudice against women, while simultaneously forcing topics into the forefront that Azara had no business touching. In a lot of ways, I don't know why this game exists, and while I'll always advocate for free speech and celebrate this game's right to be around, I can't believe that it was funded and found a publisher that'd be willing to touch it. In a lot of ways, this game has no idea what it's doing, and given the fact that I purchased it at a price of $2 down from its listed price of $20 nowadays, it seems that the potential audience couldn't be bothered with it either. The Suicide of Rachel Foster is one of the worst attempts I've ever seen at covering topics like suicide, and that includes Tommy Wiseau's The Room, which brings us to a much better way of handling sensitive issues with Gone Home. I'll just get this out the way, I'm not going to be covering Gone Home in the same beat-by-beat style that I just used for The Suicide of Rachel Foster. This video has already gone for far too long. This is going to be more of an overview with some key pieces that compare directly to what 101 Games was doing with their game in order to point out how good writing and having a better understanding of more delicate matters can really elevate a work as opposed to Azara's Joker-brained fumbling. First, for the uninitiated, Gone Home was developed by Fulbright, or as they were previously known, the Fulbright Company, an indie studio founded in 2012 by Steve Gaynor, Jonathan Nordhagen, and Carla Zimonia. The three developers had worked together previously on Minerva's Den, a DLC side story to BioShock 2, which most critics and audience members considered to be even better than the game that it was bolted onto. And in 2013, they released their first game with Gone Home. Gone Home is very similar to Rachel Foster, at least in the way that they are both structured. You play as Katie Greenbrier, a 21-year-old who returns from traveling overseas and exploring different parts of Europe. While she was gone, Katie's mother, father, and sister all moved into a new house, with you seeing the place for the first time during the events of this game. But upon arriving at the doorstep, you can immediately tell that something strange is happening in this space, and that this is not the homecoming that one would expect. Taped to the front door is a letter from who we soon find out is your younger sister, Sam Greenbrier. And the note tells you that she is sorry for not being able to see you, and she begs that you please don't dig around the house looking to find her. The house is locked up with seemingly no one inside, and you search the porch until you find your way in, where it is made apparent that not only is no one around, but that everyone must have left fairly recently, as the house definitely has a lived-in feel. Progression in the game comes from exploring the space, reading handwritten notes, or picking up little keepsakes that act as clues in order to piece together how your family has been getting along in your absence. But the actual plot beats come from picking up certain key items or notes that trigger voice-acted journal entries that your sister had written.
You know that feeling where the first moment you see someone, it's like they have a big gold star around them?
And that's pretty much what you do for the whole game. You enter a room, you fumble around in the darkness looking for light switches in order to get a better look at things, all while the superb atmosphere fills the space. There is a light storm outside, and this old house creaks and lights flicker as the building reacts to the forces outside. The mood in this place is perfect, with Chris Remo's terrific soundtrack picking up whenever little moments happen that advance the plot, and small things like some chilling phone messages setting up the game's early tone.
Sam, where are you? talk to you. Please be there.
At the beginning of the game, you find that certain parts of the house are locked from the inside, with the east wing, basement, and most notably the attic being closed off to the player. The attic is the end goal of the game, with its entrance being one of the more visually interesting things that you see early on, with red string lights lining the hatch, and a note labeling it as Sam's dark room with the message, "Do not enter if the red lights are on." And we set out exploring this house with this message potentially signifying that someone may be in the attic above you the whole time, but the game is designed with this being the last place that you'll ever be able to enter. So we explore the space, learning everything we can about our family and how they are getting along in their new space. Both Rachel Foster and Gone Home implement a similar structure of exploration. Both gate progression through the space with progression through the story, but Gone Home does it a lot better. RF had a whole hotel to work with, but there really were just a handful of rooms that were of consequence, and most characters are really only explained on a surface level in those spaces. Gone Home is careful to make this building feel like, well, a home. There are little details everywhere that point to exactly who these characters are. And Rachel Foster did this decently in just a few key spots, but it never reaches this type of characterization that we see in this space or what we learn from Sam's writings. Early journal entries from Sam point to difficulties being the new girl in school, with students being aware of the house that she now lives in, as it is known to the locals as the Psycho House. We learn that Sam makes some early friends by playing Street Fighter II at 7-Eleven. This game takes place in 1995 with everything down to Lisa Frank-inspired folders, TV programming guides, and tape cassettes grounding you in the era. We learn that Terrence, your father, is a struggling author with 2 failed books under his belt, books that seem to be alternative history sci-fi adventures that center around the Kennedy assassination, but clearly his books aren't paying the bills, so he has been recently writing copy for a home theater equipment magazine. Your mother Janice is apparently a park ranger, and though she seems to be trying to keep the spark in her relationship with Terrence, between the stress of his professional failures that he is treating with isolation and drinking, and the weirdness that comes from being in this particular house, it is obvious that he has been pulling away. I will get to the weirdness about this house soon, as it does show a much more nuanced understanding of dealing with delicate issues when compared to Rachel Foster's insane take on things. We learn that Janice has been putting in extra hours at work, with a new ranger that has been transferred to her station to help with a controlled burn of the area. And between a husband that's been avoidant and long hours with the man, we learn through letters from one of Janice's college friends that an attraction has been formed between the two rangers, even if it does seem to be more of a small fantasy as opposed to a full-blown affair. But the main conflict in this story comes into focus as we continue to explore. We learn that Sam has made a new friend, a classmate named Yolanda DeSoto, a character that is something of a contradiction. A riot girl punk rocker with dyed hair that is also a member of the school's ROTC program. A third-wave feminist with aspirations of joining the armed forces. And while people like this certainly do exist, it is an interesting juxtaposition. And through their friendship, handing notes to each other in class that we get to read, playing Street Fighter at the local 7-Eleven, dyeing each other's hair and listening to rad music, the two end up starting a romantic relationship with each other. It is clear that the relationship has to be secret, that Sam's parents wouldn't understand, and that the couple has no real interest in their classmates finding out. But the majority of journal entries center around developments in the relationship. We learn that there is something of an expiration date on things going between Yolanda and Sam, that after school ends, she will be sent off to basic training, with Yolanda having already enlisted. Eventually, after Sam is suspended from school after an intense altercation, her parents catch wind of their relationship. But both her folks are in denial about their daughter being gay, leaving Sam in a really vulnerable space where her parents are unwilling to accept her for who she is, and with the knowledge that her most important relationship will soon be coming to an end. Now, for some more delicate issues. First, this game makes it clear that every character has their own struggle. Even with things like Janice's potential affair, we are given her motivation, we understand her struggles with it, with her even going on a date with the man to see Earth, Wind, and Fire, and learning that the man that she has been fantasizing about is not only in a relationship, but that he is also planning on marrying this other woman. But even when characters are struggling and they're in the wrong, it is never presented in the same black and white fashion that it is in Rachel Foster, with Claire being a monster and Leonard somehow being the messiah. We know that Janice's relationship with her husband is in a tough spot. We see that she is a little frustrated and that she has been taking to reading trashy Harlequin-style romance novels, but she is clearly trying to figure out how to make things work with Terrence. And she is always trying to encourage him with his writing, even going as far as to fish out crumpled up manuscripts out of the trash. She is not a bad person, she is in a bad situation, and is getting the best of her. But Terrence is really in a much more nuanced situation than it would seem if you just find the surface level clues. This new house, the Psycho House, was left to Terrence and his family after the death of his uncle Oscar Mason. And as the house opens up through progression, we learn more about the man who used to live here. He was a pharmacist who largely lived on his own, and he was a well-respected man in the community, even going as far as to open up a soda fountain in his business as a way of treating the kids in town. We learn his house had a network of secret passageways and false walls, many of which point to the idea that Oscar, or potentially someone before him, including someone in his family, ran a booze smuggling operation during the Prohibition era out of this place. And that Oscar has since used these places to hide himself away from the world following an event that changed his life and Terrence's forever. It is never outright said, but circumstantial evidence points to the fact that Oscar molested Terrence when he was 12 years old and had been potentially doing so before. In the basement, we learned some things about this man. There is a safe with a combo code in the secret room below, and after finding the code, which is 1963, which also is the last time that Terrence can be proven to be in this house, as the final tick mark on a door frame charting Terrence's height reads Thanksgiving of 1963. Inside the safe, we find a letter written by Oscar that never made it to its intended recipient of his sister and Terrence's mother, Mary Greenbrier. In the letter, Oscar basically begs for forgiveness in relation to a transgression that he had made years prior. He claims that he has removed himself from all urges and has been trying to atone, as evidenced by some religious iconography found in the house. Alongside the letter, we find a few items of interest including surgical tubing, syringes, and most conspicuously, fictional medication by the names of Aquatil and Bileron. I hadn't heard of this type of medication, so instead I decided to Google them, and after reading some theories online, with the best one coming from Reddit user Girl Take It Easy, I now feel like I understand what this medication was for. The Reddit user points out that although these drugs in Gone Home are indeed made up, there is a drug discovered in 1961 by the name benpyridol that was sold under the name Anaquil, which was used to treat hypersexuality syndromes and often prescribed to sex offenders as a condition of their parole. And with these fictional medicines having names so close to these real-life analogs, I feel that it's safe to assume that this was not a coincidence. Between this explanation of the drug and Oscar claiming to have removed himself from temptation, it seems very likely that this safe is pointing us towards the conclusion that not only did something happen between Oscar and Terrence, but Oscar went as far as to chemically castrate himself in the time since. And really, this does go on to explain quite a few things about Terrence. Clearly, he has been shutting down in this new house, potentially from the memories of what had happened here, but it also kind of explains his fascination with the JFK assassination, as it happened the same year that all of this was happening to him. A huge cultural event that a boy was able to become obsessed with and get tangled up in conspiracy theories in an attempt to keep himself in a near constant realm of escapism. Here we are not only shown the trauma of sexual abuse, but its lingering effects. We understand the offender, and although we may not forgive him for his actions, we can accept that the man was looking for forgiveness and atonement. And we understand that the victim, even decades later, is still trying to navigate how this event had affected him. Between fits of rage that can be evidenced in the basement, with his father's portrait being punched through after the dad pretty much shat on Terrence's first novel, and even going as far as to treat his daughter's sexuality with flat-out denial, Terrence is still working through everything. And then there's the concept of suicide. No, there is no suicide in Gone Home, but it definitely seems to be foreshadowed and is kind of threatened in some cases, and definitely is foreshadowed better than anything that was done in Rachel Foster. The last few journal entries by Sam are pretty hard to hear, as everything seems to be falling apart and evidence even points to the young couple breaking things off before Yolanda left. The final entry coincides with the same day that Kate arrived on the doorstep and the events of this game took place, and we learn that Sam was pretty much in a catatonic state given Yolanda's leaving. In this near final entry, she sounds tired, distraught, and just depressed.
The sunset light in this house is the saddest thing I've ever seen. I just want to sleep. When I'm in the attic, it almost feels like Lonnie could still be here. She's just downstairs. I'm just waiting to hear her hatch and come running up. Maybe I'll go up to the attic and wait.
And when coupled with the crying phone messages that we heard in the living room, I honestly thought that as I made my way to this attic, that there was a very strong possibility that we were going to find Sam dead up there. With a family that doesn't understand her, and intense love being severed so quickly, being stuck in a place where she didn't want to be, it wasn't looking good at all. And Sarah Grayson, the actress who voices Sam, just lays all of this weight on you all at once in a way that feels oddly soul-crushing. After playing Gone Home again for this video, and even knowing how it ended, I still could feel this weight. And after finishing the game, I recommended it to my girlfriend, and she played it in one sitting the next day. And as I watched as she made her way up into the attic, I could tell that she was overly tense. After the credits rolled, she told me she didn't think Sam was going to make it. And after reading some online forum posts, it seems that plenty of other audience members had also thought that this game was gearing up to end in tragedy. But instead of tragedy, we find symbols of hope. A journal entry that details that Yolanda decided to ditch her bus and wants to run away with Sam, and then finally Sam's actual journal in the corner, which explains how we were hearing all of these entries in the first place. With it finally made clear that everyone in your family is safe, with Sam having run off with her girlfriend, and with your parents off at a couples retreat for their anniversary. Everything Gone Home decides to tackle is done a million times better here than it was in Rachel Foster. And not even just the serious stuff, but even just the bullshit supernatural stuff. In Gone Home, we learn mostly through notes between Yolanda and Sam that they believe that the Psycho House was haunted by the spirit of Oscar. And although this is mostly done to fuck with the player and establish atmosphere, because there are no ghosts in this house, it does point the player to finding out what really happened in this place while making it more atmospheric. And it does make things like exploring the basement far more creepy, especially in moments where light bulbs fail, as they can be just downright spooky. Rachel Foster uses its spooky bullshit to, point to the fact that Rachel was angry about what happened to her and was haunting the timberline, and that Leonard was some sort of astrophysics genius that was able to pierce the veil. The abuse narrative of Gone Home shows how trauma can shape a person, and how it can have lifelong effects. The abuse in Rachel Foster is hand-waved by all the principal characters and even explained as true love by the person closest to the victim. And then suicide. Gone Home shows us how hard it can be in turbulent moments in someone's life, especially when they are young and everything is scarier and it just hurts way harder. Even if Sam made it out okay, she still had to suffer with everything being so unsure, and suicide seemed like a likely outcome even though it was the one that we were hoping would not take place. But 101 treated this topic as an edgy way to end an edgy game with no real sympathy for any character being subjected to Azara's cruelty. And I'm not saying all this because, oh look, Gone Home ends with a happy ending and Rachel Foster ends on a much more bleak note, so Gone Home's better. No, fuck that. Some of my favorite stories of all time are tragedies. Films like 2009's Low, Tarsem Singh's The Fall, Darren Aronofsky's The Whale, Hereditary, or even Sunset Limited. Novels like Kurt Vonnegut's Sirens of Titan, or Point Omega by Don DeLeo, and even games that end on a much sadder note like Final Fantasy X, Shadows of the Damned, or Actual Sunlight. Instead, I say this because of something that I was picking up while playing both of these titles. Gone Home is the type of work that can be handed to someone when they are going through something. It doesn't have to be the topics that were covered in this game or in this essay, but the way that problems are addressed and the way that the player is able to empathize with all the characters, this could be the type of story that helps someone get a change of perspective when they need it most. And conversely, The Suicide of Rachel Foster is the type of game that, if handed off to the wrong person, it can leave them feeling dejected, trivialized, and otherwise worse off for having played it. And I'm just going to admit it, with me having the past that I do, some of the content in The Suicide of Rachel Foster really bummed me out for an extended period of time. There are sometimes right and wrong ways of telling stories, and 101 Games made sure to hit all of the wrong notes. But if there is one thing that works in Rachel Foster and Azara's favor while comparing and contrasting these two works, it is that as of 2023, the Fulbright company is now just a one-man studio called Fulbright, with the company being shuttered as a result of harassment allegations made towards Steve Gaynor. There doesn't seem to be any sexual harassment that was reported, but it does seem that Gaynor has blown up his team with discriminatory and toxic behavior. And at the time of this writing, I haven't heard anything negative about 101's workplace environment, even if their storytelling is problematic. While playing through Gone Home, there is an option to play this game with a director commentary, and although I didn't do it this time around, I have done it in the past. But really, this feature made me wish that there was a commentary for The Suicide of Rachel Foster. If ever there was a game that I needed to learn about the developer's intentions, it was this game. But considering the fact that they've done very little interviews and they mostly seem to be radio silent as of now, they may not have interest in explaining their work. And while that may be understandable given some of the criticism that's been levied against this game, I am very curious. With The Suicide of Rachel Foster mostly being a failure in storytelling, but still having quite a bit going for it in terms of gameplay and presentation, let's just hope that the next time they decide to make a game, they can just tell a better story. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you for watching, really. This was both the longest video that I've ever done and probably the most challenging that I've ever done, as it put me into a different kind of headspace. So if you found yourself enjoying the video or getting something out of it, please consider liking, commenting, or subscribing. If you are familiar with my channel, you may know about the side project that I have going on here, which is I take every game that I've covered in one of these essay forums and I rank them in an ongoing list in order to find out what the best game is of all time. My next video will be the third one of these videos I've done, and it will be interesting to see where The Suicide of Rachel Foster stacks up and where I would put Gone Home. So if that interests you, please stay tuned, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video. And until then, you are all beautiful people, and I hope you have a great day.